August the 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded his tiny oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. The president of Iraq's much-feared army, alleged to be the fourth largest in the world, was well-equipped and battle-hardened after 8 years of war with Iran. The strain of the war against Iran had left Iraq impoverished. Saddam's savior was to be oil, but he needed its price to rise for economic recovery. He demanded that Kuwait cut production in order to force prices up. When Kuwait refused and ignored Saddam's other economic demands, he grabbed the country and its oil. Kuwait was overwhelmed. Saddam Hussein declared the country to be the 19th province of Iraq. He now controlled a fifth of the world's oil reserves. Some of the first casualties of the invasion were the Western expatriate workers, who would shortly become hostages.
There was a knock on the door, and the Iraqi soldiers just bombarded in, dragged Jerry and our babysitter outside. Then the men were taken away, and the other women and I sort of heard shots, and we thought that they'd killed the men. They started rampaging through the houses, they started ransacking them, abusing some of the women. Yeah, we were terrified. Terrified.
Other victims of Saddam's rampaging troops were Kuwaiti citizens themselves.
We are not dealing with a human being, we are dealing with the people who came to Kuwait to destroy it. Because any cities or any area that they showed any Kuwaitis resistance, they destroy it. They used tank between houses. It was a disaster, really, because I saw them when they direct one of the tank to the one house, and I think there was 5 Kuwaitis, young Kuwaitis, in that house, and they killed all. Not even killed, they cut it to pieces.
Saddam Hussein's ruthless invasion posed a problem. In dabbling in such an unstable region as the Middle East, the United States did not want to be branded as the aggressor, and it needed to have the often disunited Arab countries on its side.
America does not seek conflict, nor do we seek to chart the destiny of other nations. But America will stand by her friends.
United Nations resolutions were passed condemning the invasion. Politicians and diplomats looked for peaceful solutions. But all these attempts would be in vain, mere staging posts on a 5-month journey to war. While Kuwait was pillaged, the hostages were taken to Iraq, many to become part of Saddam's much-feared human shield.
We were loaded onto an Iraqi military plane. Quite a few of us thought that they were going to fly us up in the sky and then open the tail and throw us out the back. I mean, quite a few of us felt that, but they didn't, and they flew us to Mosul in northern Iraq. And it was fairly obvious to all of us, you know, what we were going to be used for. No one had actually coined the phrase human shield at that point, but we were going to be put somewhere to guard installations.
The members of the human shield were held at potential military and civilian targets around Iraq. Occasionally, hostages were gathered together for a photo call by a beaming Saddam Hussein.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart? And with cornflakes too.
Behind the forced smiles, there was the terror of the prospect of being held at nuclear and chemical weapons factories or anywhere else that Saddam thought might be targeted. Jackie Blear's family was now being held with others in the residential compound of an Iraqi oil refinery. They protected the children from their fears. Soon it will be the Blears' turn to be paraded on television. But Jackie saw an opportunity for her family in the worldwide broadcast.
I sort of asked one of the cameramen if the films were going to go over to the UK. And he sort of shrugged. And I said, well, if they are, can you focus on my daughter? It's her birthday. I want her grandparents to know that on that day she's alive. They did focus on her, and she had her birthday cards that we'd made for her.
Saddam Hussein put his hand on my head. It was very heavy, and I felt very uncomfortable with his hand sort of touching me. So I was very on edge, and I could see that everybody was very uncomfortable as everyone was like shifting about, and they had very fake smiles. And I could see that when he was smiling, I wasn't smiling with his eyes, because his eyes were very deep and empty.
We were pushed to the front next to him, and through his interpreter he said that it was his wish that Rachel and her family could go home for her birthday. And I asked, did that mean my husband? And he asked where he was, and I said, well, he's at the installation. And through the interpreter, I was told, yes, he was allowed to come with us.
Thanks to Rachel's birthday, Jerry Blears joined the first batch of released women and children. After a month of captivity, the Blears were going home. Many others were still held in Iraq at the mercy of Saddam Hussein.
His present to me was that I could go home with all my family, and all the other women and children could come.
And your daddy could come as well?
Yeah.
Where is he now?
My dad's there.
By now, troops from the United States, Britain, France and others were already arriving in the Gulf. A military coalition had been fashioned from an unlikely alliance of Western and Middle Eastern countries, united in their opposition to Saddam Hussein. By late August 1990, the troop build-up in the Gulf was well underway. Over the next few months, hundreds of thousands of troops would arrive in the Gulf, their immediate objective to defend Saudi Arabia from invasion. Most troops will be stationed in Saudi Arabia, initially deploying to the northeast corner of the country for training. Free Kuwaiti troops joined the alliance, which also included Egyptian and Saudi forces. Remarkably, even Syria had joined the coalition. The Arab nations had realized that they couldn't solve the problem themselves. But the coalition had been delicately put together and would remain fragile. Few of the American and British troops had seen action before. Each brought to the Gulf his emotions.
Excitement, trepidation. There's a number of mixed feelings. We were looking forward to it.
You're going to the big show. It's something we've trained for since we all joined. But then there was also some apprehension, not really knowing what's going on, but you're not really thinking of the danger.
One immediately thought, gosh, am I capable of doing this particular task? And then, of course, you realise that you are very well trained, and of course the whole brigade was extremely well trained, so that pushed that underneath and got on with the job.
Kind of lamented to my girlfriend that they weren't going to send us. 2 days later, they sent lawyers over to go over our RED, which is Record of Emergency Data, and to fill out wills. I knew we were going.
The troop build-up continued for months to take on an army that the coalition believed to be over 500,000 strong. There were hundreds of thousands of goodbyes. Some found them easier than others.
You could see all the families crying and carrying on, and it kind of gives you a bad feeling inside, because I was not married, and you don't have anything you're leaving behind. So it was kind of a bad experience not having someone there.
Others were able to take friends and family with them.
We were actually on the beach in Rhodes on an 1830 holiday. There was myself and 5 other soldiers in my battery, and we read the papers thinking nothing of it, and as we got back to the foyer of the hotel, the 1830 rep was there with his big paper showing it to us, saying, "Lads, you better enjoy yourself on this holiday because in a couple of weeks you're going for another one."
Leo Downs survived his Club 1830 holiday. Back at base in Germany, his girlfriend Nikki, also a soldier, heard that women were going to be sent to the Gulf.
My trip commander, she was looking for volunteers, and I said, yep, I'll go. Not only for serve my queen and country, but Leo was going, and if I had a chance of seeing him out there, God, I was going to go.
She was told that she was going to war, and we were told we were going to war, and we were thinking, well, let's make a wedding of it.
2 months after meeting each other, Leo and Nikki were married in a ceremony organised by their commanding officers.
So we were married on the Friday, and we had one night honeymoon, and she left.
Nikki arrived in the Gulf not knowing when she would see Leo again. As Nikki drove her first truck in Saudi Arabia, the coalition troops were nearing their peak deployment of 500,000. All of them were highly trained, but nothing had prepared them for the realities and chaos of warfare.
We landed at this big airfield, and we're like, okay, where are we going to sleep? You know, where are we going to stay tonight? Where are the aircraft going to be? When are they coming in? For the first few nights we were there, we slept, you know, basically on cardboard, you know, on a little causeway in an airport that was being built.
We arrived on a very warm, balmy, humid evening, and it was the hustle and bustle of everything that was going on. We were the boys. We'd been and got out there, and we'd arrived, and, you know, we're waiting for everybody at the big welcoming party. And going and having a look around this airbase, we realised that we were a very small cog in a very big machine.
We stepped off the plane, and it was 108. I started getting dehydrated immediately. Sergeant Nelson, he grabs me, starts making me drink water and everything, and I mean, it was just incredibly hot.
I think the thing that took a lot of us by surprise was just the sheer size of it. I mean, this desert was bigger than anything we had ever seen. I mean, you couldn't fly across this desert on 2 loads of gas. It was huge and desolate and barren.
The American troops had undergone desert training back home, but if they had expectations of rolling sand dunes, they were to be disappointed. By autumn, it could be cold and damp.
The smell of the desert, I can't explain it more than a giant wet cat litter box. That's what it smells like. When it gets wet, the smell is moldy. The flies are atrocious.
When I first arrived in Saudi Arabia, it was very cold. That's all I can remember. There was frost, it was cold, and then we moved into a tented city.
By the time Leo arrived a week later, Nikki's fears had had time to develop.
Even though I knew Leo was coming out to join me, I still had this feeling of it was going to end soon, you know, we might die.
Nikki went looking for Leo the minute he arrived.
As we got off the plane onto the coaches, I heard this little female Irish voice shouting, "Where's Leo? Where's Leo?" And obviously it was her, bobbing from bus to bus, looking for me at the back. And obviously the lads knew that I was on that bus. They were just banging on the window saying, "He's in here, he's in here." She actually got on the bus and drove us back to our camp.
Nearly 10 million tons of hardware were transported thousands of miles to the Gulf. The commanding officers couldn't wait to get their hands on it and start training.
There's a feeling of excitement buzzing around, which I'm sure you can feel. The boys in the sheds woke up this morning with a purpose, going to get the kit unloaded, and really looking forward to getting out into the desert and working alongside the American Marines. It's very exciting.
Brigadier Cordingley's initial excitement was soon tempered by practical concerns.
The first thing we did when we got out and started training was to make certain that all the weapons were going to fire straight. I mean, they'd been at sea for 3 weeks, and the soldier wanted to know his rifle was going to fire in the right direction, the tank man, that his tank gun was going to hit the target. And so we devised a very, very large number of exercises.
Military necessities were mixed up with thousands of gifts to the troops.
It was a logistic nightmare. Food, spare parts for the tanks, ammunition, all those sorts of things, trying to balance it all out. And then the business of the great British public, who were really supportive, sending through parcels. I mean, that was a real problem, because we were trying to balance whether we could afford to take up space in the aeroplanes getting these parcels out, whether that was more important than the ammunition that we might need.
Here we go. Logistical problems meant that many troops also didn't receive their desert fatigues for some time.
When we got out there, we've had the normal sort of disruptive pattern material. We didn't have the desert-type combats. So you stuck out a bit like a turd on a pool table. You know, you couldn't miss yourself. And there was a slight worry. But then through the chain, the desert combat started to arrive. We got our desert MBC suits, and we were happy with that.
One of the great fears of the Gulf War was Saddam Hussein's huge store of chemical weapons, and the well-founded belief that he would use them. He had already done so on Iranians and on his own citizens.
Want to give me 20 more of these then?
Troops were given a variety of injections and pills that they were told would protect them from Saddam's chemical arsenal.
We were given lots of injections. We didn't really know what they were for. And then, of course, some of these inoculations, too, made you feel quite ill. And so you thought, whoops, and if you knew if it was a program of several inoculations, you were going to have 2 more. Oh, this isn't great, and are people going to try to avoid them? The way we got round that is to get all the commanders together, discuss the thing, and say, right, I think this is a real problem, and we might. All the evidence says we could be hit by it, so get in the front of the queue, commanders, and have the first inoculation yourself.
We were given a cocktail of drugs, pills, everything. We took them. We didn't know what, to expect. I remember specifically the 3rd anthrax injection being quite bad. That knocked a lot of people for 6.
Some of the worst ones, like the anthrax shots and stuff, we had to get, or the botulism shot, there we go, there's another one. That we had to take that, and there was some other stuff that we had to take, and I have no clue to this day how much stuff I actually took. But I took it on the word that our colonel was taking it.
As the coalition continued to build its troop presence in Saudi Arabia, the Iraqi subjugation of Kuwait also continued with increasing ruthlessness. The country was stripped bare.
There is an Iraqi lieutenant. I saw his car, a jeep, military jeep. It was filled of clothes, TVs, electricity, and of course it was stolen things inside the car.
Kuwaitis lost their property, their possessions, and often their lives.
You cannot imagine that. A lot of injuries. We saw some people cutting hands, or they lose their, for example, part of the body. We never seen that before. And gunshot, so many gunshots.
Fawzi al-Kawari searched to ransack Kuwait City for casualties, but found so many bodies he ran out of space for them.
At that time, there was nobody evacuate the bodies, the dead bodies from the street. So we decided to take the ambulance and take around the street to take the bodies, because we have a limited space for the dead bodies on that side, the hospitals. So we decided to remove most of the freezers, food freezers, move the food and keep the bodies inside it, because we don't know what to do with the bodies.
Across the border in Saudi Arabia, the troops have been ordered to be on their best behavior. In this strictly Islamic society, they were denied many of the staple amusements of military life.
normal things which a soldier takes as part and parcel, we just couldn't do. Alcohol was strictly forbidden. Sort of pornography, girly pictures, there was none of that at all. We were searched scrupulously before we left for all of those sort of things, and everybody was made sure in no uncertain terms what would happen if we were caught with anything of that nature.
Best girly magazines we got was advertisements from the stores. I would have loved the girly magazine at that point. There was no alcohol. Some guys tried to make alcohol, didn't quite work out.
But ingenuity occasionally managed to bend the strict rules.
Alcohol and pornography did manage to get out in theatre. Not taken by the soldiers, but sent out in parcels, aid parcels through the BFPO system, disguised as shampoo, normal books with sort of porn stuck inside. I never received any, but I did see some out there. There was a very good blend of Head and Shoulders kicking around one of the vehicles at one stage.
The newlyweds were also finding the laws of Saudi Arabia inhibiting even to the mildest shows of affection.
I was actually told off by a policeman for holding my wife's hand after we'd met up in Aljabal. Well, we felt nothing of it. We were walking down the street shopping, window shopping, holding hands, and a tap on the shoulder by a Saudi policeman, a swift shaking of the finger that it wasn't allowed.
Saudi Arabia had taken a great risk with Arab opinion by inviting foreign forces into the land that proudly guarded so many Muslim holy places. The commander of the Allied forces, General Norman Schwarzkopf, controlled the military might, but he realized that King Fahd of Saudi Arabia and other Arab leaders needed handling with tact and respect. But King Fahd continued to play host to most of the foreign troops, although the Saudis occasionally had to turn a blind eye to Western indiscretions. As war itself seemed ever more likely, the Allied commanders looked back to the last big American war. Vietnam had left the United States shell-shocked for years. Present policy had to be explained in its light.
Should military action be required, this will not be another Vietnam. This will not be a protracted, drawn-out war.
General Schwarzkopf was a Vietnam veteran. The lessons of that war would influence the way he conducted the present conflict and what he expected of the other commanding officers.
The Vietnam War hung over the Gulf War conflict like a fog. In that, all of the senior leadership had been in Vietnam at least once. And I think to a person, we were bound and determined we were not going to make the same mistakes that were made in Vietnam. General Schwarzkopf gave me a mission, and I took part in developing that mission. I understood his intent, and then he gave me the greatest gift a commander on the battlefield can be given. He let me alone to execute. He said, "This is what I want done. You know how I want it done. You know what I want you to do. Now go do it."
The coming war was on everyone's mind.
We got a big job to do, and every night when I go to bed at night, I think what I'm going to do the next morning when I get up, and every morning when I get up, I think what I'm going to do every hour after that. You know, this is a big enterprise over here and a lot of responsibility, and I take it very, very seriously, and frankly, half the night I think about it too.
The troops also believed there was a big job on.
We had relatively good intelligence, and I really thought this was going to be a 3-year war, at least a 3-year war. And this is the 4th largest army in the world. And we took it very, very seriously.
All the way over, far corner, take that corner, take the top through side.
All the coalition troops took training just as seriously. They knew their lives could depend on it. In the initial stages of the conflict, training and adapting to desert conditions took up much of the day. The routine was hard, but accepted as being not only useful, but necessary.
We spend a lot of time in the British Army training and training and training. And the old adage, train hard, fight easy.
Here we go.
And we wanted actually to see if we could put into practice what we trained so hard for, whether it would be successful or not. Because that's the proof of the pudding. If you win and you're alive at the end, your training's been all right. If it's not, if you're dead, your training's not good.
The equipment had to be desertized, if you like, the very obvious business of repainting it sand colour because it all came over green. And then a lot of dust flying around. We had to stop that getting into the engine, so we had to improve the filters. Things like that.
As you can imagine out there with the sandstorms, the dirt, the debris, etc., etc., if they get into your rifle, they can cause problems. If your rifle doesn't work, you don't work. So we had a novel use for condoms. There's a lot sent out there, I don't know why. However, we used them and put them over the end of our rifles to act as a muzzle cover. You could still fire through the condom. It didn't affect anything at all, but it protected your rifle. The luminous ones went down well.
We got a massive advice from people who had fought in the desert. Old comrades who had been desert rats in the Second World War took the trouble to write and wish us good luck. And I remember one day opening a lovely letter from an old comrade, and he said, "If you're attacked by a Messerschmitt, don't forget to zigzag."
The air forces of the coalition were now eagerly testing their new, versatile, but untried weaponry.
Okay. I'll go 3-4, my 3 guys go shot, over. Run out, tail fired. Fired. Oh, we got it! Oh, that blew the hell out of it!
The Apache attack helicopter was top of the range and expensive, and when the war started, it would make the very first strike.
Well, the Apache was designed from the ground up as a night fighter, and I think that made it unique. It was an untested or unproven weapon system that the United States government had spent a boatload of money on. It was highly touted as being the tank killer, of which the Iraqi forces had, you know, a lot of tanks. And so I think it was kind of looked upon as the equalizer. In other words, yes, you've got a lot more troops, you've got a lot more tanks, you've got a lot more artillery, but we've got this Apache. We kind of appeared out of the night, and, you know, from 7 or 8 clicks away downwind, you're not going to hear an Apache. You're just not going to hear it. The first thing you're going to hear is something blowing up.
The main British contribution to the air war was the Tornado. Its job would be to knock out the Iraqi airfields, capitalizing on the skills of its pilots to fly at low level.
The only thing you had to adjust to was, one, flying at incredibly low heights. I mean, normally in peacetime we do sometimes fly down to 100 feet, but out in the desert we were flying below 100 feet, and that really does, you know, you really got to, you think it would be easy, but it's a very slow process to get down to the lower levels. Also flying over the sand dunes, you had to be very careful of visual illusions, of making sure you didn't fly into the sand itself.
The F-117, the Stealth, had been tested over all sorts of terrain, but never yet seriously put through its paces.
This was the first time that it was ever going to be used in a high-threat, hostile environment. Almost invisible technology itself, which was what was new, that no other airplane ever had. You had to be very, 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 very good to detect this on radar, if at all. We started flying local training missions at night, right around a 10 o'clock takeoff. We're getting our bodies used to the night flying. We kind of moved our whole body clocks around a little bit. We're just pretty much gearing up for night one of the war.
But nobody knew when night one would come. The next battle was to defeat boredom. By now, most of the troops just wanted to fight and go home.
One thing you mustn't allow people to do is to get bored, because as soon as that happens, they take counsels of their own fears, they get frightened. When you consider the average age of a soldier we had out there was probably 21, all sorts of worries come into their minds, and as commanders we had to make certain that they were kept away from those worries.
One of the main worries for us out there was bored soldiers, so we made up a lot of things. We had a mini Olympics using tools and things like that. You know, the javelin would use a couple of sort of 10 poles, little things like that, little competitions, quizzes, sods operas, where we'd all get together and each section or platoon would have to put an act on. We'd then all come together and perform that.
Leo Downs' Cheshire hometown may have been thousands of miles away, but he was luckier than most. His wife, Nikki, always managed to work the system to keep them together.
I would say visits from my wife were frequent. There was times where we were actually practicing where we'd fire 6 rounds, 10 rounds down the range, and this 14-tonner truck would just drive out of nowhere, beeping its horn, and everyone would go, well, what's happening here? So she'd drive through a gun position, you know, evading all the hand signals to stop, and just pull up outside my cabinet and say, honey, I'm here.
Others weren't quite so lucky.
One thing we did regret missing was the girls. There was no girls. You know, we see all through these war movies of Bob Hope coming up on stage and seeing these beautiful women, and there was no beautiful women. It was just Bob Hope.
The troops sat in the desert for months. They trained and they waited while political decisions were being made in capital cities thousands of miles away. On November the 8th, 1990, President Bush upped the stakes.
After consultation with King Fahd and our other allies, I have today directed the Secretary of Defense to increase the size of U.S. forces committed to Desert Shield to ensure that the coalition has an adequate offensive military option should that be necessary to achieve our common goals.
It was now 3 months since Saddam Hussein had annexed Kuwait. By now, he had stripped the country and its citizens of their identities.
They said that there is no more Kuwaitis, and all of you are now Iraqis, and you should change your ID. And they changed most of the hospitals' names, especially with the names that, for example, Kuwait Hospital, they changed it to Saddam Hospital. And you are not allowed to mention the names, the old name.
President Bush visited the troops for Thanksgiving in November. His visit was a morale booster during a prelude to war.
To have the president there was a great experience, a great thing to see, particularly for the troops, and that went a long way in keeping our motivation high. I was fortunate enough to eat Thanksgiving dinner on the same Humvee hood as the President of the United States.
Not bad at all. No, really. Pretty darn good.
It was a great experience for me to have somebody of his stature in America to come out to speak with us was truly a blessing for my troops.
John Borth made a video to show his family what life was like for himself and others in the Gulf.
And I want to show you my hooch in here. This is my hooch from the outside. Got the desert camunet and a CP tent on the inside where we live. And what we're going to do is we're going to go on inside, show you around. And of course we got Captain Zinda spouting off at the mouth in there, saying his usual gibberish. This is our foyer right in here, and here's the inside. Captain Zinda behind the magazine, not looking, and this is the hooch, the hooch. You can see we got all kinds of stuff. Here's one box of chow. Down here, another one underneath Captain Dinda's feet. And let me tell you, we've eaten more chow around here than you could ever imagine. Every day, we burn the head.
You want to explain
Not the actual head, but what's inside it, obviously. The commode.
At night, the communal lavatories could bring embarrassment and amusement.
It's very, very dark in these latrines. It's a 3-holer, so there's could be up to 3 people in these things. You know that there's somebody in there with you, but you're not. It's not like you're sitting in there, you know, discussing, you know, sports or anything. Well, I was in the latrine, basically sitting there, and knew that there was a person sitting next to me, but totally didn't realize until she got up and said, "Excuse me," that it was actually a woman. And I thought that was kind of humorous because she obviously knew that the chances were pretty good that the person next to her was a man, but I had no idea that the person sitting next to me was a woman.
We'd have a routine that every week we'd dig a hole 6x3, put a calm waterproof covering inside, fill it up with cold water, and have a quick toss of the dice. Whoever got the highest had the first bath. Whoever got the lowest had the one with the scum along the top. Normally I was first in because I was a water tester, and because I dig the last part of the hole, I'd put the tarpaulin inside, fill it up with water, and before anyone else was stripped off, I'd already stripped off from laying it.
The shower truck came and you were there with everybody else, and of course, you know, when you drop the soap in the sand and bending down, you feel very vulnerable, if you like, to the sorts of questions these chaps, they know you're feeling vulnerable, are going to ask you. And of course, what are we going to do next in the shower truck is a very good way of getting information out of the brigadier.
We had all these camels. Everywhere we went, we had all these camels always find us. I don't know if they were singing camels or what. They would always find us. And we had this one major. He was sitting there trying to eat his food. And he's like eating his food, and this camel comes over, sticks its head down over top of his shoulder, and he's like trying to push it away. And it won't leave him alone. It just keeps coming back. So finally he puts down his food, walks up to the camel, and punches it. I mean, he nails his camel. And the camel's like, "Arr!" and starts running the opposite direction. And then he just reaches back over and starts eating his food again. I mean, it's just awkward things that just occurred.
In late November, the United Nations gave Saddam Hussein till January the 15th, 1991, to withdraw from Kuwait. He still held well over 500 hostages at various locations around the country. But when President Bush offered to go an extra mile for peace, Saddam Hussein released the last of them. Many of them had spent months in terror, fearing they would be blown apart by Allied attack. But despite the release, there was no real sign of a conciliatory attitude by Saddam Hussein. By Christmas, peace was hoped for, war was expected.
I think we're both still hoping that there will be a peaceful resolution. But I am convinced that Saddam Hussein hasn't gotten the message yet, for some odd reason.
Despite the mounting tension, perhaps because of it, thousands of Christmas presents were sent to the troops. They celebrated as traditionally as was possible.
Little plane ticket, please. Well, you can have a little plain box, courtesy of the British Legion. Thanks.
Leo Downs had a stroke of good fortune that he decided to share with his mates.
I got on this little trip with my wife down to Bahrain where the RAF were allowed to drink, and they sort of passed over a couple of crates for the boys up in Saudi Arabia who were not allowed to drink. So I took the chance, sneaking it through the border, and we got through and had a beer for Christmas.
Christmas time was a very emotional time. Firstly, you know, the reality of being away from one's family. One was very close to where it all started. And I found that quite emotional because you had these wonderful clear skies at night with all these stars. Didn't need much of imagination to think, well, we're very close to Bethlehem, and it must have looked much like this. And, you know, the occasional carol service, well, I say occasional, quite a lot of carol services were held. And it was very moving.
religious person, but for some reason that night really hit home with me. And we were singing carols, you know, Silent Night, Hark the Herald Angels Sings, you know, just like all these Christian songs. We didn't, half of us didn't even know all the words, but we were together and we were singing it. It was Christmas Eve. The next morning, the colonel, he handed me a little thing. I think it was like a chocolate bar or something, you know, and that little thing meant more to me than a lot of other things, you know. It just meant a lot more to me than a lot.
After the peaceful interlude of Christmas came tension. On January the 9th, 1991, a last-ditch attempt to avoid war took place in Geneva. The key players were US Secretary of State James Baker and the Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz.
Don't miscalculate the resolve of the American people.
If the American administration decides to attack Iraq militarily, Iraq will defend itself in a very bold manner.
The Geneva Conference came to nothing. War was inevitable, although a few more attempts at peace kept doubts in the soldiers' minds.
All the time that we were training for it, we're thinking, we're not going to do this. This just isn't going to happen. You know, we're going to train hard and we're going to do the best we can, but we're not going to get the opportunity to do this. And so even the afternoon prior to the mission, and they came around and said, the mission's a go tonight, we're still thinking, we're not going to get to do this.
But by January the 16th, 1991, the first airstrikes against Iraq were only hours away. Tip O'Neill would fire them. By January the 16th, Saddam Hussein had ignored a United Nations ultimatum to pull out of Kuwait, and all hope of a peaceful solution to the Gulf crisis was abandoned. The main air campaign would concentrate on knocking out key targets of Iraq's infrastructure. But first, the Allies wanted to take out Iraq's border radar system. Saddam Hussein would then have little idea from where the Allied planes were coming. The Apache helicopter was chosen for that first crucial mission. Its Hellfire missiles had to be 100% accurate for the safety of the missions to follow.
In earlier briefings, we were told, you know, only fire 2 or 3 missiles, only fire what you need to shoot, because after we do this attack, we have to get back to our unit and be ready for the onslaught. So my commander's thinking, I don't want all my guys going in there and shooting everything they got, and then we got nothing to fight with when we get back. Well, he pulled me over on the side prior to us going out on the mission and said, Tip, I know I briefed everybody to only shoot 2 missiles, but I'm telling you, I want you to shoot whatever you have to shoot to make sure that that site is not operational when we leave there.
Each Apache pilot had a night sight camera tube attached to his eye. What he saw was then recorded on tape. But even as Tip secured his night sight, he still didn't believe he was going to war.
At 5 minutes prior to takeoff, we had done all of our run-up checks, had everything programmed, and we were ready to go. And we're still sitting there, and we're still talking back and forth, my crew partner and I, that we're not going to go. And then they took off. And we're like, well, they're taking off. And he said, yeah, I guess they're taking off. And I said, well, I guess we're going to do this. And he says, I guess we are. And we took off.
Tip's target was 30 miles inside Iraq. He crossed the border in the early hours of the morning. At 2:38 a.m., he got the order to fire.
Certainly, if they knew we were coming, they would have turned all the lights off, huh?
They don't know we're here. I have no idea.
At the point when we got within 10 seconds of firing, our platoon leader was to make the call, target intent. Well, you know, that's the longest 10 seconds in the world if you're sitting there and you're waiting to shoot somebody. So I kind of went through 10 seconds in my mind, and when you're kind of anxious, a real 10 seconds ends up being probably about 6 seconds. So I think that I did actually fire my missile probably maybe 2 seconds early.
This one's for you, Saddam. But hold her steady. I got it. Yes.
Tip O'Neill had fired the first shot of the Gulf War. He was about to fire 6 more.
I see people running around now.
All right.
Hold her steady.
Got it. Fall back.
Breaking right. Okay, break. Break.
Coming left.
Break off big time.
What's wrong?
We're too close, man.
It wasn't until after the first shots were fired and we were on our way back to the staging base that the fear set in, because then I think at that point is when we realized exactly what we had gotten ourselves into. And there was quite a bit of elation at that point, because then we knew really that we really started the whole thing. We knew the sooner we started this thing, the sooner we were going home.
It was almost 6 months since Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. His country now lay prey to the thousands of missions that would follow Tip O'Neill's first strike of the Gulf War. The air campaign against Iraq and the military might of Saddam Hussein began in the early hours of January the 17th, 1991. It was designed to take out key military and logistical targets in order to neutralize the country's will to fight. Drew Nichols was due to fly in the third bombing mission of the night to destroy 2 chemical weapons factories.
The day started out pretty much normally like I always do. I got up, I can't remember now, 10 o'clock-ish in the morning, went out and I ran my 2.5 miles, came back, just kind of wandering around, noticed a lot of hustling, bustling around the area, but didn't think much of it. And then somebody came up to it and goes, "Hey, did you hear? We're going." I go, "Oh, where are we going?" He goes, "You idiot, we're going to war tonight." I go, "Well, gee, I guess I have to go take a shower then." I went and sat down, wrote a letter to my wife going, you know, this could be it. You know, I love you. Thanks for being married to me for 4 months. And but here I go off to war.
While other pilots prepared for takeoff, Drew had hours of waiting before his solo mission began.
I didn't take off till 1 o'clock in the morning. So I actually had a chance to go back over to our compound where we ate dinner and watch the first wave of the war on CNN.
Five months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
We got over there and said, yep, bombs work, the planes work.
In Baghdad, people rushed to safety to escape the bombs that came from a silent enemy. At the coalition bases in Saudi Arabia, the troops expected retaliation from Saddam. They took refuge in bunkers like these.
I was down in my bunker around 2 o'clock in the morning and the phone rings. I pick it up. The war started. And I'm a little excited. I sort of wake up the colonel and he goes, "Yes, I know." I'm like, okay, so he didn't want to tell me.
The platoon sergeant came to us and told us we needed to get in full chemical gear and go to the bunker because the war started. So I panicked and a couple other people panicked, and we helped. Everybody got in their stuff and in their chemical gear and went out to the bunker. So it was just a matter of sitting there waiting. It was like a moment where reality hit. You realize, oh my God, I could die.
We crossed the border. Now, of course, we're in our quote-unquote stealth mode. Lights off. Radio dead also. So it's kind of like submarines. We run silent, run deep there. And so here we go. We're quiet, we're dark, and we can't see anything.
In the first 7 hours of the air campaign, 750 sorties were flown over Iraq.
When I came off that target, I go, well, this going to war stuff is pretty easy. Nobody's shooting at me. The stealth mode works. Nobody saw me. I'm golden. I can do this forever.
For most Baghdad residents, the raids were nightly nightmares.
The sky become just a ball of flames, a big ball of flames. You didn't see the airplane. You just feel the sound passing over you, but you see nothing. And then the bomb, the explosion.
The coalition troops back in Saudi Arabia continued their claustrophobic imprisonment.
Just sitting there in the bunker, it was just torturous. Just the sheer thought of sitting there not knowing if your life is getting ready to end. It'd be like watching a satellite come straight towards you or a meteor come straight towards you and not know if it's going to veer off or if it's going to hit you. It just, that sheer anticipation is enough to kill you.
Drew Nichols' second target was not as easy as his first. He flew towards it with a false sense of security.
I look off in the distance and I see this kind of glow. And I'm going, boy, I wonder what that is down there. Then as I get closer and closer, I realize that's AAA, the anti-aircraft artillery. And I'm going, boy, somebody's getting the crap shot out of them. I hope that's, or I'm glad that's not me. AAA, it looks like the biggest fireworks display you can ever think of, and that's what you're trying to fly through. I tried to look for a place to go through, tried to get skinny. I tried to picture poking a pencil through all the AAA and see whether I could fit through there. I prayed to God and said, get me through this, and went right through the AAA, dropped my weapon, hit my target, and climbed as fast as I could to my exit altitude.
Within minutes of it starting, news of the air war was beamed across the world.
This operation will be one of the most ferocious airstrikes ever seen in the history of warfare.
Saddam Hussein was reportedly making a speech saying that this is the beginning of the war. The Islamic Holy Jihad, the Holy War, has just started. There were curtains of anti-aircraft fire.
The ground troops could only stand and wait.
I remember looking back in the desert, looking up and seeing the huge American bombers just going, and they looked so peaceful, and I thought, what sort of carnage and devastation they're going to wreak out the far end, you know. And at that stage I felt a little bit sorry for the Iraqis.
You look up and you can just see red lights going north. Just hundreds of red lights going north. Seeing all those planes go north, we knew it was the beginning.
It was not, though, the beginning of the end. 5 more weeks of airstrikes would try to bomb Saddam Hussein into submission. The airstrikes against Iraq were relentless. The big fear was that Saddam would reply with chemical weapons. The new buzzword was Scud.
Everything we'd heard about Saddam's army was that it was the 4th largest army in the world. They were extremely well equipped, they were extremely well trained, and the big thing that everybody was banging on about was Scud, 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 Scud.
If chemical weapons were going to be used, it would be the dreaded Scud missile that delivered them.
I wasn't scared of getting shot. I wasn't scared of getting blown up. But the biggest fear I had was doing what we call the floppy chicken, being gassed. That was my personal biggest fear.
Despite nuclear, biological and chemical training courses, NBC courses, the troops' fears lingered.
Some of the things we were told about these nerve agents, just a drop of it gets on your skin and you're gone. We constantly had people coming to our units with new briefings to tell us exactly what these things would do to us. It was on everybody's mind.
NBC suits were issued to all troops to combat anything that Saddam could throw at them.
It's very claustrophobic. You put it on, it's warm, it's very warm. The charcoal gets on you and gets on your face and your body. And pretty soon, after a couple days of wearing this, it gets pretty nasty.
The respirator makes living extremely uncomfortable. When you're wearing the respirators, your performance becomes degraded, and the degradation is equated to the amount of time that you're in the respirator. Your performance declines.
The NBC courses taught the troops how to fight in their respirators and suits, as well as how to protect themselves from any lethal bombardment.
You could win a war with nuclear biological warfare. You don't even have to fire a shot anymore. You could send a rocket over, and within an hour, you could take the old enemy forces out with nuclear, biological or chemical warfare. So if you haven't done the training and you're not happy with your training, then you're going to have to brush up on it, because the threat was there, and we were quite 100% certain that he was going to use it.
The threat of chemical weapons remained the great unknown of the war until the very end. It struck terror into the people that had opposed Saddam Hussein and lived within range of the Scud missile.
The media were always around trying to cover the campaign. One of the questions I was always asked was, well, what are we going to do if they use chemical weapons against you? And of course, I didn't have a clue. I'd never had the opportunity to ask the president what we were going to do if they used chemical weapons against us. But I lied every time. I would say the consequences will be so horrible for them if they use chemical weapons that I can't imagine they would ever contemplate it.
Saddam Hussein couldn't compete with Allied power. He couldn't hit back directly and hope to win. But he could play on the fear that his Scuds inspired. The day after the war started, Saddam targeted Tel Aviv. He believed that the coalition was fragile, and that if he could draw Israel into the conflict, the Arab states would abandon the war. Respirators were issued to all Israeli citizens and to the press.
We think they're only using conventional warheads, not chemical. But it's too early to say. We're waiting for the state radio to give us some instructions to take off this equipment before we can go out there and find out just what has happened.
The Americans had put pressure on Israel not to retaliate, but they knew there was a limit to Israel's restraint.
Israel is not a participant. Israel is not a combatant. And this man is elected to launch a terroristic attack against the population centers in Israel with no military design whatsoever.
Scuds were notoriously inaccurate, but even a Scud couldn't miss a whole country.
If you're tossing these things, so to speak, into a city, as was the case with Israel, even if they're off by half a mile, they still can cause a great deal of damage and a great deal of fear.
Scuds caused few deaths, but they were highly publicized. At one point, it seemed inevitable that Israel would retaliate. It rarely ignored attacks on its people. In return for American Patriot missiles, which would shoot down the Scuds, Israel promised to try its best to stay out of the war. But the Patriots never hit as many Scuds as was hoped. Scuds often fell apart in the air, creating multiple targets which were difficult for the Patriot to hit. Despite this, the Israelis did keep out of the war.
They sat back and took this, and it wasn't easy to take, and stayed out of this, because had they entered, I think the coalition could have fractured, or probably would have fractured, and then we would have been left with a mess.
RAF pilot John Peters and his navigator John Nichol were preparing for their first mission of the war. Tornado pilots were skilled at low-flying sorties. Peters' mission was to knock out an Iraqi airfield.
We were going in, and just at about, I suppose, about 40, 50 seconds out from the target, suddenly on the right-hand side of the aircraft, we got a big puff of black smoke. On the left-hand side, a big puff of black smoke. And you suddenly see anti-aircraft fire, and that really, it doesn't so much unnerve you, but it really, bloody hell, people are shooting at us. Suddenly, this huge kind of sort of hand of God just smacked the aircraft across the desert. I mean, we're talking 25 tons of metal, and it was just like floating in the wind, like this sort of sycamore seed. John started screaming, we're on fire, and I said, I know we're on fire. This wall of flame was just sort of marching towards us, and it was about 12 feet behind me, and that's why John was shouting, because he sits 6 feet behind me. 3, 2, 1, eject, eject, eject. It's a quarter-second delay, and it really feels an awful long time. And then it's as if you have this big giant who sort of grabs you by the shoulders and just throws you out the cockpit. And you get all the rocket noise and the sound. The canopy opens with a jolt. And we ejected so low, the next thing you know is the ground just jumps up as we hit the ground. And it's just deathly hush.
John Peters and John Nichol were in the heart of enemy territory. After 2 hours walking, the inevitable happened.
We saw an Iraqi truck. The Iraqis got out, about 15 of them. You could sort of hear the Arabic on the wind, and they start marching towards us, and we were just lying on flat, open ground. There was nowhere to hide. And you just think, I mean, there's no one's going to save you. No one. It's not the 7th Cavalry, and they got about 100 yards from us. They saw us, and then 15 guys with Kalashnikov machine guns just open up, and you're lying, covering your head, and the bullets are bouncing this far from your head, and it's kicking sand all over your hair, over your back, and these bullets are bouncing over the top of you, and you just sit there, either waiting to be hit or do you fire back, and it's just mayhem. I don't know how they missed. They didn't stop firing until about 20 yards.
The stealth pilots had suffered no casualties at all. Although their plane was almost impossible to detect by Iraqis, many of the men who flew them took extra precautions.
We're very superstitious, so a couple things that I would do is do our combat wallet and make sure it was the same all the time. Well, in that, you'd carry your ID card, you'd carry what we call a pointy talkie, and this is to help you if you go down, and you'd carry a blood chit. So I'd take these and I always stack them, blood chit, pointy talkie, ID card, and I'd stick them into this top pocket right here in my leg. Then I wanted to be just like those folks in World War II were flying around, and I wanted to have a picture of my new wife. I took her picture and I put it with her towards me, and I put it in my upper pocket towards my heart, and I flew all my missions there with her.
As the bombing of Baghdad continued, the world's media gathered to watch. General Schwarzkopf was the star of the show.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror,
Drew Nichols, who had nervously flown one of the first stealth missions, was now getting used to them.
Hitting a target is very emotionless. There's a lot of emotions on my part, me being hurt or anything like that, but the actual destruction of the target is very, I think, you're very withdrawn from it. You're at an altitude above the target. A couple times I've seen, I saw trucks and cars driving across a bridge that I was blowing up. To me, it was just a target, and it was my job.
It was John Peters' bad luck to be imprisoned in the Iraqi capital on the night of one of Drew Nichols' stealth bombing missions.
We entered Baghdad at night when there was a huge air raid on with bombs going off and anti-aircraft fire, which sort of rattles your bones, really shakes your spine. And within 2 seconds of being shoved in a room in this building, a bomb hit the room, and we were blown across the floor and covered in rubble, and the ceiling came down.
I believe our bombs actually knocked the doors of their cells off the hinges. We weren't aware that POWs were there, but I remember hearing stories from the POWs that was their worst experiences when we were going after that building. They said they knew how accurate we were, and they were afraid that they'd get hurt.
As John Peters began his solitary confinement, training for the ground troops in Saudi Arabia continued in preparation for a ground war that most believed would eventually happen.
It was hammer and tongs. Fitness training twice, sometimes 3 times a day. Weapons training, drills with vehicles, drills as dismounted soldiers. Very, very hard.
Move! We were literally thrashed during training, so we knew we'd need to be tested and we need to be war ready, basically. If we're going to war, we need to be war ready. The commander needs to be happy that you are ready to go to war and fight and maybe die for your country. If you're going to send a soldier that isn't trained, then he has always got the chance of letting himself down, the team down, and the actual battle and the country down.
Objective clear. It was now over 5 months since the first troops had landed in Saudi Arabia. Training took up fuel, ammunition, and energy.
We trained so hard that several weeks before the attack began, I gathered my commanders together and said, look, let's back off. We have been training so hard. I am worried about our Marines being exhausted from training before they ever begin this thing. So we did. We cut back a little.
There was a great danger of boredom setting in among the ground troops and their morale falling. They wrote endless letters to their families, and just occasionally, on local leave, they could get to a telephone.
I cannot overemphasize how important it was for soldiers to communicate with the people they loved. Curiously, the telephone is not necessarily the best of ways of doing that, because a chap comes out of the desert. Almost the most important thing is he was going to ring up the girlfriend, the wife, the loved one back home. And imagine a long queue, and then he gets to the telephone box and he puts through the telephone call and there's no answer. Or worse still, you know, bizarre example, some bloke the other end who he's never heard of before. And imagine his morale, because the queue is then so long, he's got to get to the back of it or wait till the next day, or worse still, wait another 3 weeks before he gets another shot at the telephone. Not a good way of communicating. Letters much better.
The long wait for action by ground troops meant that fears had had time to develop and fester. Religion became popular.
I pray all the time, whether I was in the war or not. That's just part of my life. During peacetime, you know, if you go to a chapel service, you might have a handful of people. But in the war, the tents were full with Marines that want to get closer to God, that needed that spiritual help and guidance. Probably Christians that maybe just don't go to church very often, but these are people that were there, and I can tell you for a fact that they became real religious because it was a wartime situation and everybody needed something besides just their training to get them through.
Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him.
It was funny, the amount of people that started devil dodging when it all kicked off.
To what God is doing in history.
The Padre, from being a figure that's normally shunned by people, became quite popular. And a number of people were sort of going and speaking to him and taking him off to one side. I'm a Roman Catholic, and I can't say I chased down the Catholic priest to have a chat with him. In my mind, you look after yourself, you know, and by chatting to the the Catholic priest or the padre isn't going to make my performance any better. You don't have to go to a padre to publicly think that God's going to look after you.
If anyone needed the protection of God, it was John Peters. His Iraqi torturers were trying to prize information out of him.
You could hear the thud as they hit you, and then it's difficult to describe it, but it hurts. But then after a while you get used to they beat a certain part, and that gets really numb. But then they move to another part. They hit you with baseball bats, and that's a certain type of pain, and then they'll kick and thump you and smash your face against the wall. And then they'll hit you with rubber truncheons, which is really like a wheel. It's very sharp pain, and it's just unreal. You can't really remember everything that happened. It just goes on and on and on, and for 4 days you're blindfolded and handcuffed, and you just take it, really.
As the months passed, the fears of the troops who were going to fight the expected ground war became more real. John Mulheron was typical of many.
My biggest worry was becoming a casualty. Not being killed, getting a leg blown off, an arm blown off, something like that. Becoming a liability for the rest of my guys to look after me. I felt responsible for all the guys in that section, and I didn't want to let them down. And that was the thing, that if I did get hurt, what would happen in the middle of an attack if I was taken out.
Despite any fears that he had, by now, John Mulheron just wanted to get on with the war and get back home.
When I was out there, I missed having a life, not having a social life, being stuck with the same people day in, day out. Now fine, they're comrades, you're your friends, but at times you can't get on top of each other. When you're living in a space 6 foot by 4 foot, you know, for days and days and weeks and months, it can get a little bit irksome. You get all these letters from home, from family, friends, and they'd be describing what they'd been up to and this, that and the other, and that brought it home even more. It was a kick up the arse for us to get everything sorted out and get back.
Even more keen for the war to end was captive pilot John Peters, whom Saddam Hussein was now trying to use to help his propaganda war.
They came along, kicked you awake, took the bag off your head, and you're really quite blinded by the light. Take your metal handcuffs off and your arms start shaking because suddenly you've got real pain as you've got blood in your hands. They then get a pistol out, hit you about the head by the pistol, and then they just put the gun straight right between my eyes, and they pull the hammer back and you can hear everything, and time here really slows down. I mean, you can remember absolutely every little, you can remember the smell, and you can just remember their faces. You had two guys here, and the guy looked me straight at me, and you didn't look at him in the eyes, and you were just looking at this gun. And they said, Peters, you're going on television, or you'll never see your wife and children again.
Most of the captured American and British airmen were forced onto television. Saddam regarded them as his war trophies and wanted to display them.
I think our leaders and our people have wrongly attacked the peaceful people of Iraq.
Peters had little choice but to take part in the recording, but was determined not to cooperate.
I spoke very quietly, so I had to pile the microphone up on the books. Then I got this major, who was quite convincing, slapped me about the face, right up here against my face, and said, "You will do this." And so all I tried to do was not say the script, and, you know, all my friends did fantastic things in war. The only thing I'm proud of in the fact that I didn't say what they wanted me to say. All I said was I was Flight 10 Peters, I'd bombed an airfield. And I didn't say any of their script.
One of the most telling images of the Gulf War. It personalized the suffering, reminding us that in this high-tech war of long-range killing, old-fashioned thuggery was still at work. Saddam Hussein never even bothered to release what little John Peters said on the broadcast. Nevertheless, Peters' morale fell.
After the TV, however much you think you've given your best shot, you feel really low. I felt very low after that, because I thought it was. I thought people would think I was a traitor and weak and had given in.
Almost every night, John Peters heard and felt the Allied bombs as he sat alone in his prison cell. The air campaign continued to soften up Iraq for the ground war. By now, Drew Nichols was a bombing veteran.
Bridges were the best targets to hit. They were the most fun, if there's fun at all. Not to hurt anybody, but they looked the best. The way they fell down and stuff like that. Destroying something that was built so well.
Saddam's military command and supply lines were being systematically destroyed. US Marine Chuck Ingram had been waiting to fight for 5 months. The pressure was mounting, and like most of his colleagues, Chuck was desperate to see action.
We were itching for a fight. Some people may find this crazy at the time, but we actually prayed. It was part of the bravado, I guess, that you have to come up with in order to go do something like this. We would actually pray for war. We'd say, let it happen.
26-year-old Chuck Ingram's wish was about to be granted.
On the evening of January 29th, 1991, is when war came into Chuck Ingram's life.
Three weeks before the ground war began, Iraqi troops made a preemptive strike across the border into the Saudi Arabian town of Al-Khafji. The attack took the Allies by surprise. Although the town had been evacuated, Saudi territory had been captured. 2 reconnaissance teams of US Marines were hiding in the town. One was led by Chuck Ingram.
They owned the town. They just came through like a Mayday parade, hatches open, totally unopposed, totally unaware that we were there watching. We believed we were seeing the beginnings of Saddam Hussein's, quote, mother of all battles.
The Marines had had the chance to escape at the beginning of the invasion. Instead, they had decided to stay and hold themselves up in a bombed-out building.
My initial reaction was that we should go. I didn't voice this, but I was the actual team leader, and you have people's lives in your hand. Our corpsman came up to me and said, "We're Marines." And for me, that's when I made the decision, we're staying.
By now, the Iraqi troops were uncomfortably close to Chuck and his team.
The Iraqis were in the building with us and didn't know we were there. Quite luckily, they didn't come up the stairs. But you could look out the stairwell, and if you wanted to, you could spit on their helmets. Nothing happened for the rest of the night. So there was quite a bit of time there for us to see what was going on and literally think this was our last day on the planet.
But a few miles away in the desert was the Marine artillery backup. They could talk to Chuck by radio.
Roger out. It was about 40 minutes ago, sir, when they were requesting rules of engagement because they had a possible target.
As a television news camera recorded the bombardment, Chuck and the other Marines told the artillery precisely where the Iraqi positions in Al-Khafji were.
Once you let them know where they're firing, that stuff comes in. If you're within 600 yards, there's a possibility that that round could stray and hit you.
Chuck was so near to the Iraqi troops that he was forced to call in artillery dangerously close to himself and his men.
We didn't call anything further out than 300 yards. We called stuff in across the street, less than 50 meters away. Artillery won't adjust anything less than 50 meters because the guns just aren't that accurate. In a sense, we called stuff in on ourselves. When the artillery would come in, it was such a display of power that it really made you feel like you had some sort of supernatural power, that you're calling this stuff in, and it was a very, very, it was a rush. It was such a high, and it was a feeling of being invincible. It was a feeling of having your big brother come down the street and beat the hell out of the bully that's been tormenting you. It made you feel good.
In the middle of the battle for Al-Khafji, a US Army truck was driving through the desert to the south of the town. The woman driver tried to give her 3 male colleagues directions. They ignored her.
I stopped the trucks and I told them we needed to take that exit. They refused to listen to me. They said that I didn't know where I was going. I had not been on any missions, and that they knew where they were going. We had to go straight. We saw the Persian Gulf off to our right, and I told them we weren't supposed to see that, but they didn't want to hear me. And we drove past about 200 Marines to over on the right on the hill and came right into Khafji.
Melissa's colleagues soon wished they had listened to her directions.
The Iraqis got off a lucky shot that hit our steering box and knocked our steering out, and thus we rolled forward into a wall. The Iraqis were coming up from our left, so we started to run up the inside of a wall. There was a huge mansion-like house that we were trying to get to, where they surrounded us with AK-47s, pistols, and everything, and they told us to get down.
Marine Captain John Borth was dispatched to find Melissa.
They weren't in the vehicle. The tires were spinning, deuce gear was in there, but they weren't in the vehicle. We don't know if they fled or were captured.
When we set up a secure position around the vehicle, we found out they weren't there. Deuce gear was laying everywhere. The rear tires on the vehicle were still spinning. I, at that time, requested permission to continue my search into the town, but was ordered not to go into the town.
John Borth's search for Melissa was called off because by now Chuck Ingram, oblivious to Melissa's plight, was calling in air support from US Marine Harriers.
Captain Greg Bogard put his weapons right across the column. I remember he hit their fuel truck because the explosion was tremendous and it blocked out the targets I was going for when it finally went out. So I put my Rockeye through the clouds that he'd just left. The Rockeye was designed to be an anti-tank weapon. It's a cluster munition that holds 247 bomblets inside of it. We would release them 2 at a time in a pattern that would basically devastate a football field and even 2 or 3 football fields.
As they were walking us back, an air raid began. We heard a huge explosion. We thought our truck had blown up. We found out after the fact that it was the house we were trying to get to that had been blown up in the air raid.
The Iraqis had paid a heavy price for their invasion of Al-Khafji. Many had been killed. Their hardware destroyed by the artillery and airstrikes called in by Chuck Ingram and his team. With Iraqi forces in disarray, Chuck made his move.
As we ran down the last street, we could see freedom 500 yards away. We knew we would be safe if we got out there. I just said, go, go. Because one thing I learned while we were there is action will always beat inaction.
Only afterwards did Chuck have time to think about his feelings during the battle.
There are a lot of emotions going through you. Initially, I experienced fear And then it just became a calm, and I was able to think clearly. And although you could see people in armored personnel carriers that were actually burning, they were already dead, but their bodies were burning. Tank battles are going on right outside your building. Stray rounds are falling on the building. You've had a tank with its machine gun actually shoot at you, and the round goes straight through the center block wall in front of you. It just really doesn't sink in. I really think it's the adrenaline.
I feel proud that I did my job, but I was scared to death. Honest truth, scared to death.
3 days after the incident, I started crying uncontrollably. Not a type of boo-hoo crying, but my body heaved. And I really wasn't thinking of anything in particular at that moment. It just happened.
By now, Melissa Rathbun Neely was on her way to Baghdad. She didn't know what was going to happen, but she could imagine what might.
It took about 2 days for them to get us from Kafji up to Baghdad. We rode in dump trucks, we rode in buses, we rode in jeeps. At one point during our transportation to Baghdad, one soldier, Iraqi soldier, attempted to fondle me. And I made the decision then that I would rather die than to be violated. And I had my arm across my chest because it was wounded. They had put a sling-like on it. And he continued to bother me, and I reached across with my left arm and I punched him in the arm. And he pulled out a gun, and his superiors who were in the front seat turned around and told him no. And that's where it ended, but I would rather die than be violated, and that was my decision. So luckily I made the right one.
Al-Kafji was retaken after 2 days. And Saudi troops were given the privilege of being the first to go back in. The ground war now loomed, and the Al-Kafji episode had given the Allied officers a valuable insight into the Iraqis' fighting strength.
Kafji was a boost of our morale because we retook that town with the Saudis and the Qatari forces. So that made us know at that time that this so-called formidable foe, fourth largest army in the world, could be defeated. Up until that time, our intelligence was saying that we were going to have a tough time and that there would be many casualties. But that Kafji fight told our leaders, told our troops, that this was a destructible force that we could not easily take, but certainly win.
From an intelligence perspective, it was good for me. We learned that the Iraqis could not move, shoot, communicate at the same time. Once this attack began, it became sort of disjointed and wasn't conducted very well. So that was something we were pleased to see. Maybe most important, we learned that if they got their nose bloodied in round one, I mean, if you were able to hurt them and they took casualties, they seemed very reluctant to come back for any more.
From the first sorties on the night of January the 17th until the end of the war, the Allied bombers flew over 100,000 missions, dropping nearly 90,000 tons of ordnance on Iraq. 291 cruise missiles were launched against targets that required pinpoint accuracy. The Allies had set great store by smart weapons and their concentration on military targets. But on the 13th of February 1991, 2 laser-guided bombs destroyed a bunker containing Iraqi civilians, many of them women and children. 314 were killed, and the incident gave Saddam Hussein a chance to claim the moral high ground. The Iraqis claimed that the bunker was merely a shelter for innocent civilians. The Allies, that it was a legitimate military target.
It's not true! What kind of military situation that they are talking about? Where is it? Where is it? Just tell me, where is it after that all?
Although it emerged that the bunker probably had been used for military purposes, for once, General Schwarzkopf seemed rattled.
We are not indiscriminately targeting civilian targets, and I think that the very action of the Iraqis themselves demonstrate that they know damn well that we're not attacking civilian targets. Since right now they've dispersed their airplanes into residential areas, they've moved their headquarters into schools. Under the Geneva Convention, that gives us a perfect right to go after those things if we wanted to, and we haven't done it.
The bombing of the bunker brought the Allies a public relations disaster. Despite this, their raids continued. Coalition airstrikes had destroyed much of Iraq's military capability and infrastructure, but Saddam Hussein's troops still occupied Kuwait. After 5 months of waiting, it was almost time for the coalition ground troops to fight. They were ready.
When my troops heard and got the mission, they were just ready to go. And the bottom line was we couldn't get in there and do the job fast enough.
Exhilaration's the main thing that I felt when we were warned off and we knew we were going to war. We're having a chance to go to work, to put into practice everything that we trained for. And apprehension, yes, huge adrenaline rush, a little bit of terror thrown in.
You just get this feeling of, yes, it's going to be over soon. We're going to be out of here. By then, you know, my unit had been on the ground 6 months in the desert, and we were just itching to go. We were ready to, you know, go to Baghdad and go home.
The air campaign had come to an end. From now on, the planes will be used as air support for the ground invasion of Iraq and the retaking of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's grasp. On the 22nd of February 1991, Saddam Hussein turned Kuwait into an inferno. In setting fire to hundreds of oil wells, the Iraqi leader sent a defiant message to the coalition forces. If Saddam could not keep the Kuwaiti oil, then he was determined not to allow the West to have it. Weeks of bombardment by coalition planes had severely damaged the military infrastructure in Iraq, but had failed to oust Saddam's troops from Kuwait. A ground war to recapture the kingdom had become inevitable. In Saudi Arabia, 500,000 coalition troops prepared for battle.
In some sort of naive way, having done all the training, we wanted to go and do the business. But of course, no one knows what a war is going to be like until you're in the middle of it, and once you are in the middle of it, probably not a great place to be.
For many, like US Marine Fred Stokey, it was a time to come to terms with going to war.
One of my fears was of dying and not having an heir. I wasn't married at the time. I didn't have a son, didn't have a daughter. And it kind of bothered me in a way that I didn't want to die without having a son or a daughter.
I definitely thought that the British Army and the Allies would take mass casualties. You know, Saddam Hussein, who had been dug in for months, who had concrete bunkers, you know, we thought he had the upper hand.
Nikki had good reason to worry. Her husband Leo was based on the front line.
And all we wanted to do is get into Iraq, take out his troops, get him to surrender or actually kill him or his troops and actually get on that plane and get out of there.
But Iraq had a formidable army, estimated at around 500,000 men. and Saddam's personal troops, the Republican Guard, had a fearsome reputation. They were well-trained, well-equipped and experienced after 8 years' war with Iran. And the Iraqi leader believed the coalition forces would not find the battle ahead easy.
Saddam was thinking that they are going to conduct a ground battle. But he thought he was ready for it. And he was thinking that he is going to win.
Iraqi commanders had fortified the Kuwaiti coastline where they believed US Marines would launch their attack. But the Americans thought an amphibious assault would result in heavy casualties. General Schwarzkopf, the coalition commander-in-chief, had decided to attack on land. US Marines, supported by Arab units, would cross the border into Kuwait. It was hoped this would convince the Republican Guard that this was the main attack and draw them into the battle. French and US Army units would then move into western Iraq. Finally, the 7th Corps of British and American forces would push forward and turn in a devastating left hook to destroy Saddam's elite troops. But the Iraqi defenders had laid thousands of mines which concerned the US Marines.
The Iraqis had put up two very significant minefields that had created a heck of a barrier. So we knew that we needed to breach it very quickly, because if you take too long in doing that, then it allows them to bring their forces to bear on you.
Scott Walsh was one of the Marine Harrier pilots tasked to destroy the heavy armored units behind the minefields.
General Boomer told us, I need you guys to hit the artillery. I need you to take out the self-propelled rocket launchers, the self-propelled artillery, the fixed artillery positions, the armed personnel carriers and armor, which the Iraqis use to counterattack immediately once a unit goes through a breach and they're not dispersed.
The night before the advance, US Marines prepared for the battle ahead.
We were told to try to get some sleep, and it's kind of hard to get some sleep when you know the next day you're going to be in combat, and it's just anticipation. Let's get it on, let's get it on, let's go home. And Lieutenant Colonel was like, you know, you really don't want to be thinking that way, and, you know, a lot of Marines are going to die out here doing this.
Early next morning, the Marines waited for the order to advance across the border and towards the burning oil wells.
It really looked like, and it's going to sound cliched, it looked like hell. It was totally dark, except for the light given off by the fires. Billowing smoke. The fires would go, I would imagine, maybe 20 feet in the air, and then past that, it's nothing but black smoke.
The smoke, I can only keep going back to the smoke and the soot and the stuff that was laying over top of us, and we were breathing this stuff in. It was laying on top of our eyes.
Coalition planes flew low into the smog and attacked Iraqi defenses in preparation for the advance.
We were going after an active artillery battery that was firing, and the only thing you could really make out was the muzzle flashes coming out through the haze, and that's what we were focusing our weapon systems on, was just the muzzle flashes, because you couldn't make out a whole lot more.
You've got Huey helicopters going through, doing what's known as psychological operations. They're coming through with all sorts of crazy stuff coming out the loudspeakers. It was a very eerie feeling, extremely eerie.
At 4 a.m. on the 24th of February, the ground battle for Kuwait began. As US Marines crossed the breach, they came into contact with Iraqi forces dug in on the border.
We pushed very hard. They were reeling back, and we did not want to let up on that momentum that we had created.
The Iraqi defenders put up little resistance. The Republican Guard, Saddam's elite troops, had been ordered out of Kuwait weeks before. The Iraqi leader relied on these professional soldiers to prop up his regime, and he had decided he wasn't prepared to sacrifice them to protect Kuwait. The conscripts left behind were no match for the US Marines.
By the time we had gotten most of the units through, the Iraqis just started giving up in waves.
The coalition commanders now feared Saddam would escalate the war by using his arsenal of chemical weapons to halt the advance. He'd used the tactics successfully against enemy troops in the war with Iran only 3 years earlier.
Most importantly was, of course, the threat from chemical and biological weapons. We knew they had both, and as a result, we were always very concerned about what they were capable of doing to us. And that was a big worry, because this was probably the first possible chemical or biological war since the First World War, and none of us knew quite how we were going to react.
We'd been warned off by the company commander in my section that we were going to do the chemical recce on the first position, which is a bit of a job in itself. It would mean getting out the vehicle, checking around for liquid and nerve agent vapours, and getting contaminated, which wouldn't have been a problem. But when I asked the company commander, what's the score if we do get contaminated, if I am stuck out there and I'm dirty, you know, to put it in another word, he said, we'll just leave you there, but don't worry, someone will come and sort you out. Which didn't fill me with that much confidence, to tell you the truth. And when I tried to explain it to the guys, you know, they weren't fully appreciative that we'd been picked for it. But at the end of the day, that's what we had to do.
Attack from chemical weapons was also preying on the mind of Fred Stokey as he made his way through the lines of surrendering soldiers.
As I was moving towards the Iraqis and looking through them, I saw this one, had like a colonel, so I pulled him out, and as I was walking back, I turned, and the other Marines were throwing on their mop gear. And I reached down to grab my gas mask, and that's when I realized I had left my gas mask inside my vehicle. And I can't explain the feeling. It's just pure terror. It just creeps up inside you. I closed my eyes, I held my breath, and I ran for all I was worth in the direction of my vehicle. Bumped into it, expelled a bunch of air, ran around to the side of the vehicle, threw open the vehicle, grabbed my gas mask, put on my gas mask, and breathed out as hard as I could every ounce of whatever I had left in my lungs. Got a good seal, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, if this had been a real attack, I'd be dead.
The Marines' attack had been so devastating, Saddam had ordered the Republican Guard to stay in reserve. General Schwarzkopf's fear was they would retreat before 7 Corps' left hook could reach and destroy them. So he ordered the British in the west to advance 12 hours early.
We drove up to the border in a huge snaking line of bright lights. It was incredible. There was so much traffic around that we came to a screaming, rather a juddering halt just south of the border, waiting for the traffic in front of us to clear. And I think the Americans and probably the Royal Military Police were trying to sort out this jam and get us on through. It was very much like a policeman on point duty guarding the door and making sure the right people went through at the right time.
But after 5 months waiting for war, just across the border, the British advance was halted once again.
After about 10 minutes of earning across a few sand dunes, there was a camel herder pushing a stream of camels across our front. And someone came up on the radio and said, what do we do? Do we shoot these people out of the way, shoot the camels and keep moving, or what? And we again juddered to a halt. First a traffic jam, now a camel herder. And the whole advance came to a halt and allowed the camel herder to push his way across our front before we started off again.
In Kuwait, on day 2 of the ground war, Iraqi tanks launched a surprise counterattack on US Marines. American planes were called in to provide air support.
I flew a first mission at 6:30 in the morning. We saw this Iraqi armored unit attacking the left flank of the 2nd Marine Division, and we had to go after that. I was preparing for running a target when I got hit by a surface-to-air missile, a handheld type. Hit me in the right rear hot nozzle of my engine. I turned the aircraft to the south, jettisoned my bombs, and the plane was pretty much engulfed in flames at this point. My flight controls finally froze up, and then my plane pitched over. So I said a quick prayer to the manufacturers of the ejection seat and pulled the handle. One moment you're in your aircraft, you're in the most modern technology that mankind has produced. You're the tip of the spear, you're the hunter. Next thing you know, it's 1 million BC, you're all alone on the ground, it suddenly seems very quiet, and you're very aware of being alone and very vulnerable.
Scott Walsh had failed to make it back over friendly lines. He found himself deep in enemy territory.
There was a minefield out in front, but the mines were rather crudely placed. They were physically sticking up in many places, and I was making my way south through there. After going maybe a mile, I saw some personnel and vehicles to my south. So I ran back and hid in another trench I just passed, and got on the radio. I said, "Hey, I've got personnel and vehicles to my south, and I can't identify them." And they were about to strike these people, but they saw the inverted V on the Humvee, and that was the sign of the Allied vehicles. So they said, "Hey, those are friendlies. Make your way south." So a young Marine Lance Corporal came running up, full NBC gear, top to bottom. I was a little more relaxed, felt like I was rescued. Of course, he was a little more anxious, said, "We need to get out of here. There's a lot of Iraqis in the area." Of course, I thought this was friendly territory, and I didn't argue with him, though.
Other coalition soldiers were not so lucky. Saddam had many prison cells usually reserved for Iraqi opponents of his regime. These were used to hold captured prisoners of war. Melissa Rathbun Neely had been taken to Baghdad after she was captured near the Saudi Arabian town of Al-Khafji.
The food was absolutely disgusting. The breakfast was some kind of soup or porridge or something, and it had like pebbles in it, like baby rocks. It was very nasty. Lunch and dinner were the same thing. You had a huge bowl of rice with what I'm hoping was either chicken or beef. I have no idea. I'm just hoping that's what it was.
RAF pilot John Peters had been shot down on the first day of the air war. He'd been a prisoner for nearly 6 weeks.
One of the American prisoners of war started chatting, and we were going on about food, because you think about food at the time. And he said, "I'm that hungry, I've picked the scabs off my arms and put them in my soup. At least it's something to chew." And I know it sounds gross now, but it just makes you giggle. You knew exactly what. And you thought, yeah, that's a fair call. But they just didn't feed us.
I kept calling them to ask them to let me out so I could use the restroom, which was ultimately a hole in the floor. Real cute. But they finally, a higher official came down. From one of Saddam's higher officials came down and told them to let me have that corner so that I could have access to the restroom or to the washroom.
We were in the corridor, and sitting there, bag on your head, handcuffed, and you haven't had water for, I don't know, a day and a half, nearly 2 days, so your lips are splitting, your skin's flaking, and you just feel generally bad. And suddenly the Iraqis came along, and they kick you sort of, you're in a semi-stupor, half asleep, half awake, they kick you awake, and they say tea. And they lift your black bag, and they feed you the tea. So you sit, and you go, shukran, shukran. They go to the next guy, tea, tea, and you hear this guy say, shukran, and you suddenly think, great, I'm not alone. So they went about three guys down, and suddenly they got to this American, they said, tea, tea. And you heard this American go, no, sir. And, you know, under your back bag, you kind of think, this is ridiculous. I mean, I don't smoke, but I'd have a cigarette, you know. You go. And then they said, no, you have tea. Tea good for you. And this American said, no, sir. And eventually they went apoplectic. You could hear them go, why you no have tea? Why you no have tea? And the American just sat there and he went, no, sir, I can't. It's bad for me. It's got caffeine in it.
The prisoners' suffering was made worse by the nightly attacks on Baghdad by Allied bombers.
I remember one night during an air raid, I was coming from the restroom. I guess I had a brain lapse. I forgot where I was. I forgot that I was in the middle of a war. I forgot that I was a prisoner. I just looked up and saw these real pretty lights going into the sky. Then I realized, it dawned on me that they were tracers coming from anti-aircraft armory that the Iraqis were shooting at the Allied planes. There was a lot of air raids that hit close by. It was scary.
But Saddam also had the means of attack from the air. His arsenal of Scud missiles were capable of hitting targets hundreds of miles away. On the night of the 25th of February, Saddam targeted coalition troops in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia.
All the people are up here!
28 US soldiers lost their lives, and 98 more were injured. The same night, hundreds of miles to the west, the British made contact with Iraqi forces.
We were on the front edge of what was believed to be an Iraqi position. The huge explosions started going off behind me, and I could see these bars of light arcing through the night sky above me and crashing to the ground, probably about 3 kilometres in front of us. And after about 10 or 15 seconds, the whole horizon started boiling with red and black explosions. And it was the most incredible fireworks display.
I think that was the only night that I thought I was at war. The deafening sound and everything going through, and that was when I thought, this is happening. This is really happening.
Leo's wife Nikki was 100 miles behind the front line. She saw the attack reported on television.
It was a dark picture, and just suddenly, out of the dark, came masses of rockets firing off, lighting up the sky. And it was MLRS, the multi-rocket launcher system, basically firing. I was just worried for Leo. He was, I think, probably 100 metres in front of the MLRS. And I just burst into tears.
I woke up the following morning with a right black eye, because obviously I was looking through the sight at looking for the tanks, and with the force of this rocket launcher going behind me, it pushed my eye straight onto the sight, and I got a black eye out of it.
Watching this going on was frightening, and you felt that if you were underneath it, like the Iraqis, that their will to fight back, would have been very limited indeed.
Under cover of the artillery barrage, the British moved up to destroy Iraqi positions. And at first light, hundreds of Iraqi soldiers emerged from their bunkers to surrender.
I've never seen such a bedraggled, demoralised, sad-looking group of individuals in all of my life. They'd been through an awful lot, and you could tell that by looking at them. They were really pleased to see us, which in a way, you know, was a little bit sick, because they'd been the enemy, and, you know, there they were sort of cheering and clapping and hugging us, and it was a bit pathetic to look at. Now, I would hate to think that I'd do that myself in that situation, but you never know. I've never been there.
For some troops, searching the abandoned positions provided an opportunity to learn more about the men they were fighting. Fred Stokey was surprised by what he discovered.
One of the weirdest things that I found when I went down into one of the bunkers was they had porno magazines everywhere, you know, and all this time I had stereotyped the Iraqi soldier as being a strict Muslim, you know, following the Quran and believing in, you know, their religion. And what I found was the Iraqi soldiers that I saw and when I saw how they lived and all that, I was just amazed at how stereotypical I was wrong, you know, that these guys were just like us, you know. They had the girly magazines, we didn't, so that was kind of not like us.
But for others, the prisoners were little more than a nuisance.
We didn't have that much contact with them. It wasn't our job to shepherd and get together prisoners of war. We just bypassed them, sent them further to the rear.
Take you to a collecting point, and then we'd give you something to eat, something to drink, and wait for some other people to come and collect you to take you to somewhere to stay.
The high numbers surrendering began to slow the British advance. Prison camps had been set up behind the front lines, and rearguard troops like driver Nicky Downs were moved up to help guard the prisoners.
When I was first told by my troop commander that I'd be going up to the POW camp to help guard it, I wasn't happy. This was the enemy. This is why we came over here. Who put me through all this pain, crying, worry? So I was angry. But when I got up there, I was like, I felt sorry for them. Basically, a lot of them are very old, very cold, very thin, and they were probably being treated better by us than Saddam Hussein. The POWs just wanted to get home. They didn't want to fight. They just wanted to get home to families, and that's what they were looking forward to.
On day 3 of the ground war, British tanks were moving east in search of Iraqi armoured divisions.
A tank is a very noisy, very hot, very smelly environment. There are 4 of you in a little metal box with the lids all shut, and it's diesel fumes, it's the fumes of cordite from the weapon systems, oil, BO, bacon butties, just the smell of war, really.
That night, the British encountered the Iraqi heavy armour. It was clear that the Soviet-made tanks designed in 1955 were no match for the much more advanced British Challengers.
There was a first round hit on this tank, and as the round impacted with that target, a huge mushroom cloud billowed up from it. And I looked through my visual sight, and I could see hundreds of men, little matchstick men, running away from this target. And it was a very dispassionate moment. Here we were shooting at an enemy who was 2.5 miles away. He probably couldn't see us, probably couldn't hear us, and yet we'd wreaked this death and destruction on them. And it wasn't till later, about 2 hours later, that we actually came across some Iraqi soldiers who came out of a trench in front of my tank, that, if you like, the stick men became real men, and the reality of war really struck home.
In Kuwait, Iraqi tanks littered the battlefield. Many were still burning. The US Marines made their way through the debris towards the airport. Fred Stokey was in one of the lead vehicles.
There was a minefield off to our right, and there was an exploding Iraqi tank off to our left. Our vehicles were moving through this, and the Humvee that I was driving has basically plastic sides on it. There's no protection whatsoever. And the rounds were coming across our hood. They landed next to beside our vehicle, picked up the side of the vehicle, threw it back down.
Stokey made this recording as his Humvee came under fire from the burning tank.
Oh my God, we're sitting next to a burning tank and firing rounds.
And it scared the hell out of me. When you become a Marine, you know, one of the biggest things is you think you're immortal. You really do. You think putting on that uniform you could stop a bullet with. But at that particular point I realized, you know, I can die out here. And
I picked up the microphone and I was yelling over the radio, "We gotta move, we gotta move."
Hey, we gotta move. We are sitting right next to this thing. Break, everybody settle down.
I wish I could go back to this day and control myself enough that I had never called over the mic, "We gotta move, we gotta move." You know, I feel ashamed because of that. Just those words that I said over that mic, I feel ashamed that I let down my Marines that were around me, that I lost my cool.
By the morning of the 27th of February, resistance in Kuwait had been crushed. Just 4 days into the ground war, Kuwaiti and US armed forces led the convoy to free the city.
Flags all over the place, people just honking their horns, riding around, screaming, what I'll call whooping it up. I don't know how they make that noise, but they make a certain noise over there that to express when they're happy, and they just had nothing to say but good job, Americans, thank you, stuff like that.
We felt then that, you know, it's all been worthwhile. Here are people that have been brutalized terribly by the Iraqis, and we've been able to play a role in taking this horrible burden off their back.
Many Kuwaitis spoke of cruel treatment from Saddam's soldiers.
They beat us. They put the cigarette in our bodies, and they put some, and our friends, some irons, and electric irons. They did everything. They did everything bad for us.
They've collected women, children, and young men between the age of 15 to 55. And we don't know where they're held. We don't know where they are held. Are they inside Kuwait or are they outside? We don't know.
Whether they are alive
We'd like to know, are they alive or dead? We don't know.
And the full horror of the Iraqi occupation began to emerge.
We recently found this room with some of the equipment that they've been using for torture. This is a steam machine, pressurized water coming through the pipes through this, and most of the time they put it in the ears.
With the main objective, the liberation of Kuwait, secured, the Arab members of the coalition saw little reason to carry on the war into Iraq. President Bush came under pressure to announce a ceasefire. But General Schwarzkopf was determined to finish off Saddam's army before a ceasefire was announced. The British had reached the northwestern border of Kuwait. They were now told to advance further east to try and cut off the Republican Guard.
It was like the charge of the Heavy Brigade, 150, 60 years later. Here we were, tanks, hundreds of tanks, charging across the desert.
I took great pleasure very early in the morning, I think, when we crossed the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border, of stopping and ordering a cup of tea, because it seemed a rather sort of typically British thing to do, to celebrate.
The coalition troops had suffered few casualties in the war, but as the British led the advance, this was about to change. Above the warrior fighting vehicles of the British Fusiliers, American A-10 planes were looking for Iraqi armoured divisions.
I remember looking up and seeing the two A-10s, and I thought, good, we've got some air cover. You know, fine, no problems whatsoever. Its primary role is tank killing, and it's bloody good at its job.
The A-10s, nicknamed tank busters, were armed with heavy guns, state-of-the-art missiles, and had a fearsome reputation. The US planes didn't realize the vehicles below them belonged to their British allies.
We were all displaying the sort of friendly marker panels. The visibility was good. There was no way, in my mind, you know, or any reason for him to have engaged us. But he did. The Maverick missiles went straight into the vehicles. The first vehicle was hit. A number of guys in the vehicle, a couple around. As you can imagine, the shock, the noise, and the devastation from one of those things going off is really bad. And seeing the carnage that they cause, you know, I'll never forget that. But mass confusion, you know, lots of casualties. The guys that were alive were certainly injured with a lot of shrapnel. There's some people in shock. A very good friend of mine was a section commander with the 2nd vehicle. When the first explosion happened, he told his guys to stay in the 2nd vehicle, and that was the right decision to do. They were safer in the vehicle. He went across to check what was going on with the first vehicle and to assist in the casualties, and his vehicle was then blown up.
Nine British soldiers lost their lives. 11 more were injured. It was the largest single British loss of the war.
As with all conflicts, it is expected that casualties will occur. We plan for it. We take precautions to deal with it if it should occur, and we have dealt with it in the way in which we have been trained. But it doesn't affect and it doesn't alter the sense of shock and the sense of loss that we all feel. But I think we can all be assured that those 9 members of the battalion, of the battle group, who lost their lives yesterday will never be forgotten. We will remember them.
On the morning of the 28th of February, the British reached the main road linking Kuwait to the Iraqi city of Basra. The retreating Iraqi army had been bombed by wave after wave of American planes 2 nights before. Many had died inside cars and trucks they had stolen from Kuwait. For John Mulheron, it was a gruesome sight.
Dead bodies, burning bodies, mummified corpses, you know, it can be sometimes quite shocking how blasé you become, and you've got to really keep a grip on yourself and make sure you keep yourself in check. I remember having to sort of reprimand quite physically 2 of my guys who had caught with their arms around an Iraqi corpse, putting a cigarette in his mouth and putting a pair of sunglasses on him. You know, it was as if life had no value.
In fact, most of the troops had fled into the desert during the attack. Many had died on the road to Basra, but not the thousands reported at the time. But in Washington, President Bush already knew what effect the grisly sights of the Basra Road would have on support for the war. After 100 hours of fighting, he decided to call a ceasefire.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. All United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations.
One night, the bombing stopped and the silence was deafening. I mean, just absolutely nothing. And that's when you hope that the war is over, because you can put no other explanation as to why the bombing has stopped.
One of the soldiers at the side of the road flagged us down, one of the Allies, and said, "It's over." So me and my friend were like, "Hooray, you know, it's all finished." We got back to our location, and we couldn't actually celebrate by drinking, because obviously it's not allowed out there, but it was happy faces everywhere.
You're lying in this cell, and it's cold and damp, there's water on the floor, there's no toilet facilities, just concrete walls, and you've got one blanket. And suddenly this Iraqi came along, and he's in a grey suit, light grey suit, opened the little hatch, and you go and stand, he says, "Flight 10 Peters, just thought to tell you, the war's over. if there's anything my staff can do for you, please, please do tell it. Would you like a shower? I'm sure we can sort it. And if you'd like some... Oh, are you cold? Oh, don't worry. Would you like some blankets? Please bear with us. There's been a war on. You're going to be released soon, and we'll take you home. And that's how I found out that the war was over.
But for some, like Marine Fred Stokey, news of the ceasefire was less welcome.
I felt betrayed. I don't know how else to describe it. I felt betrayed. I was glad I was alive, but I didn't feel that we finished it. I don't want my son having to go back over there when he's old enough to join the military and go do something that I could have done 20 years ago. That just irritates the hell out of me.
Saddam was desperate not to give the coalition forces any excuse for continuing the war. He had instructed his generals to agree to all coalition demands.
The most important point that we discussed was the immediate release of all prisoners of war.
As we got off the bus, people were screaming at me, asking Melissa, how do you feel? Melissa, did they treat you okay? Melissa, are you all right? And it just went over my head. I didn't understand that they were speaking to me because, like I said, I was so naive in my thoughts that I thought just my parents knew.
It was just this frenzy to get photographs, and I just remember the American ambassador's sort of face getting pushed aside of these journalists trying to take photographs of us.
At one point I had to use the restroom. And this was the biggest joy for me when I walked into the restroom and saw porcelain. I just about fainted because I got so used to that little hole in the floor in my prison.
As the hostages adjusted to their newfound freedom, the soldiers who had fought so hard for it were preparing to leave the Gulf.
When we got on the aircraft to go home, everyone had on the seat a little note from the army psychiatrist telling us how to cope with life when we got back to gone back to Europe.
And I remember one of the things, I may be phrasing it wrong, it might not have been written quite so crudely, but sex might not come easily having been away that long from your wife. Now, of course, the one thing that we were all looking forward to doing was to seeing our wives and girlfriends very much indeed. And in a funny sort of way, one didn't need that pointed out to you. It made you laugh rather than think this was helpful.
We were given orders not to go have any alcohol, any of us, even if we were of age. First thing I did when they let us off the plane, we had a layover. We went to the bar and I bought everybody a beer. And that's the first thing I did. That's when we knew we were home.
I don't think I had a drink after I got back. I had a pizza. I wanted a pizza, and I got a big old pizza, and I ate it all myself. Proud to say.
Getting home was an emotional moment for Melissa.
The best thing for me was getting off Air Force One at Andrews Air Force Base and searching through the crowd and seeing my mom and my dad and my fiancé Michael.
And John Peters was looking forward to seeing his wife and children.
We flew in. All the photographers took their photographs of getting off the plane, coming back to Germany, and then whisked away to a building where I was reintroduced to my family. And I tried to think I was going to be strong. I wore a big jumper because I was really thin, so I got into Cyprus a really big jumper so I didn't look too thin for heaven. And I very much try to continue what I did as a prisoner. I'll control my emotions, etc., and I'll just, so that they don't concern. But I did. I thought Guy at 2 years old, he'd forget who Daddy was, really. And Guy ran out of this building along the path, going, Daddy, Daddy, and that's a wonderful moment.
Although weakened by the war, Saddam had kept some of the Republican Guard away from the fighting. He used his loyal troops to put down uprisings in the north and south of the country.
At the time, we all thought Saddam Hussein would be toppled and someone would replace him who would be better and the thing would be sorted out. Didn't happen.
10 years on, Saddam is still in power. Although his army was badly beaten, it is fast being rebuilt.
I can tell you that Saddam Hussein is a big liar. And he is now trying to convince the Iraqi people that he win the battle against the war, that he win the war against the Allied forces.
In Kuwait, many feared the oil wells would burn for a decade, but the predictions were unduly pessimistic. The last fires were put out only months after the war ended. But for some of the Gulf veterans, the war left more permanent scars. Saddam never used chemical weapons during the conflict. However, most of the soldiers had received injections to protect them from such an attack. For some, this cocktail of untested drugs began to produce unwelcome side effects.
I suffer from what they call Gulf War syndrome. I have post-traumatic stress disorder, I have migraine, headaches, I have joint problems with my knees, I have memory lapse, not memory lapses, but problems with my short-term memory, mood swings. So, yes, I'm affected.
Ever since the Gulf War, I've had severe migraines to the point where I can't work. Another thing that started occurring is like an arthritis pain throughout all my joints, and I've been told that, you know, it's nothing. Well, why am I feeling it if it's nothing then?
The coalition commanders took great pride in the men and women who served in the Gulf.
Professionally, one was very satisfied by what had happened and took great pride in the fact that all our training had been proved to be correct. Professionally fulfilling in that respect, and that the soldiers had performed, as British soldiers always do, in a superb way.
And for the American forces, the Gulf War was the first real test since the humiliation of Vietnam.
In terms of the people's confidence in their Army, their Marine Corps, their Air Force, their Navy, Vietnam was laid to rest.
The prisoners of war faced and conquered a more severe test. John Peters has learned to live with the painful memories of his imprisonment.
At the end of the day, you can't change anything. My whole experience, I just have to accept it. I have to accept being shot down. I have to accept the constant review of everything, my captivity, the media response. That is just the way life is. And I very much have viewed my life since the Gulf like my time in captivity. You just have to accept it and roll with it, because you ain't going to change it.
240 coalition troops died during the fighting. But for the lucky ones who survived, the conflict marked a turning point in their lives.
I matured fast out there. I settled down. I wasn't the rogue as I used to be. I wasn't prepared to go discoing, clubbing every weekend and spending the money I'd saved. I was then married. It was time to settle down.
I think everybody changed slightly, having been out there. Some for the better, some not. But I think everybody did change, and it was just getting the family to adapt to that change and adapting to that change yourself. I probably wasn't a very nice person to live with for the first couple of weeks having come back from the Gulf. But I think I'm all right now.